what's up? I should speak to this? Yeah. Okay. I think people will be trickling in, which will make the first exercise sort of interesting. Will be a confounding factor maybe, but okay. Just going to go ahead and start. Hello, everyone. My name is Kerem Oktar. I'm a soon-to-be fourth-year graduate student at Princeton working with Tanya Lombroso and Tom Griffiths. I study disagreement, judgment, and decision-making. Today, I will be talking to you about how people can persist in their beliefs in the presence of widespread, large-scale disagreement and controversy. Okay, so we're going to start with a little exercise. You may have seen this picture before. Just look at it. Make sure that you perceive it as you would perceive any normal object. Okay, simple question. What color is the dress? Now, I want you to raise your left hand if you think it's black and blue, your right hand if you think it's white and gold, and don't raise your hand if you don't know what color it is. All right, a lot of hands. Seems to be evenly split from here. I know it's probably hard to see from over there. Okay, great. You can lower your hands. So, here's an additional piece of information. This was an extremely controversial picture on Twitter, such that half the people that looked at this, more than 2.5 million for each side, thought it was black and blue and white and gold. So it split the population in half. Half the people that look at it see it to be a different color. Okay, given this additional piece of information, and the fact that I'm in the white and gold group, I guess, what do you think is the true color of this dress now? Okay, so raise your left hand if you think it's black and blue, right hand if you think it's white and gold, no hand if you don't know. Okay, we're seeing some hands, a lot of no hands. This was my modal prediction. Okay, here's another question. Is global warming a result of human activity? I'd like to see left hands for yes it is, right hands for no it is not, and no hands for I don't know. Let's see the hands. All right, that's what I personally like to see. Here's some additional information. Once again, you may know, in 2016, according to Pew Research, this issue split the US population in half, such that 150 million people thought that global warming is a result of human activity, and 150 million thought it was not a result of human activity. Okay. Given this additional piece of information, I ask you again, is global warming in fact a result of human activity? Left hands for yes it is, right hand for no it's not, and no hands for I don't know. See the hands? All right, that's once again what I like to see, especially because that's what I predicted, but also because, you know, it's better for the planet. Okay, so we just got some data. We saw that in the case of the dress, the modal response seems to be that people don't know. They seem to be suspending judgment. At least they're suspending judgment more so than they are in the case of fossil fuels, global warming, and climate change, where people seem to be persisting in their views. Okay, so I don't think that this is, you know, specific to fossil fuels or climate change. I think when it comes to any of our most important opinions, I could have asked you the same sort of question, and you would have probably persisted in your view in the presence of widespread disagreement. For instance, when it comes to whether we should make vaccinations mandatory in epidemics. And this brings up a question. Why and how do we persist in our beliefs in the presence of large-scale disagreement? What are the cognitive mechanisms that enable this phenomenon? So today, I'm going to show you some evidence that people in fact persist in their views for a lot of different controversies. I'm going to describe a theoretical model of persistence. I'm going to give you some evidence of how people in fact persist that relates to that model, and then I'm going to walk you through some implications and next steps if we end up having time. Okay, so in experiment 1, we recruited 356 participants on Prolific. This was pre-registered, open materials, open access. You can find it on the conference paper. In this experiment, we gave people 16 highly controversial issues from 4 domains, from morality, politics, religion, to science. For instance, whether genetically modified crops are safe for human consumption. The design was extremely simple. We first asked people for their own opinion when it comes to the issue. So for instance, for the issue humans have souls, people would indicate whether they think humans have souls, yes, no, or suspend judgment. We found that when it comes to these controversial items, perhaps not so surprisingly, people in fact tend to have opinions. very few people suspend judgment or are agnostic, roughly 20% of our participants. Okay, we then asked them how confident they were in their judgments. We found that people were very confident when it came to their extremely controversial views, with 80% indicating being very confident or moderately confident in their controversial views. We then asked them to indicate their own perception of the US state of opinion when it came to this issue. So using these three sliders, they would indicate the population, the percentage of the US population that agrees with the claim, that disagrees with the claim, and that have not made up their minds. So these are all their own estimates. When we look at their own estimates, and you can see these in the density plots here with the line going through them indicating the mean score, participants perceive roughly half of the US as agreeing with their own views, about a third as disagreeing with them, and about a sixth as not having made up their minds. So what's important here is that participants are in fact perceiving large amounts of disagreement when it comes to these issues with their own views. We find some variation across domains such that participants perceive more agreement when it comes to science and the least amount of agreement when it comes to politics. Okay. Afterwards, we had our key measure for this experiment. We asked participants to reflect on this disagreement. Does the fact that, however many participants percent they indicated of people in the US do not share a view about whether this issue makes you question your own view, why or why not, and then we asked them to explain their thoughts in a paragraph. We found, after coding these paragraphs, that an overwhelming majority of participants do not question their views when reflecting on this persistent disagreement, and with little variation across domains. Okay, so you may be wondering, is this surprising? Is this a reasonable sort of response? Well, epistemologists have thought about this question quite a lot, and they identify three kinds of responses that you can have to controversy that are reasonable to hold. You can conciliate, so move your credences towards those of a disagreeing other. You can suspend judgment, so become agnostic with respect to the issue, or you can persist. And we're finding that people are in fact overwhelmingly persisting. But how are they persisting? What is enabling this behavior? And this is where our theoretical paths to persistence model comes in, where we integrate insights across disciplines to try to understand persistence and give it a holistic treatment. So here's the model. I'm going to explain it very simply. Each branch is going to represent a conceptually distinct route to maintaining your views in the presence of controversy. First, very trivially, you may be ignorant of disagreement. So you may have put yourself in an information silo and not be exposed to disagreement whatsoever, in which case you can sort of trivially persist in your views. But often, we do in fact recognize controversy. We're aware of which issues are polarizing. In such cases, you can have an epistemic explanation for why you persist in your views. You can think that disagreeing others might be uninformed or less competent at judging the issue than you are. You can also have meta-epistemic reasons for persisting in your views. You might think that the issue is fundamentally subjective or unknowable, such as whether euthanasia is moral. If you think, of course, that an issue is not truth evaluable, then you do not need to take other people's opinions as evidence in updating your own view. You can also have non-epistemic reasons for persisting in your views. There are obviously incredible amounts of costs and benefits that come with holding particular views. You can be socially ostracized if you change your mind about important issues like climate change, for instance. Okay. So going back to the first experiment now, I read through these 356 open-ended responses, which are a lot of open-ended responses, and coded them in accordance with the paths to persistence model, had an independent coder do the same thing too. And what you find when you look at people's explanations is that often they do in fact correspond decently nicely to the categories that the paths to persistence model identifies. So we also find cross-domain variation in how often these types of explanations come up. So we find, for instance, that epistemic explanations are much more likely to be generated for scientific controversies. We find that meta-epistemic explanations, such as appeals to subjectivity or knowability, are much more likely to come up for religious controversies. And we find that non-epistemic and ignorance are rarely appealed to explicitly. Okay, so one issue obviously with this kind of experiment is participants have limited time, so maybe they're reflecting on single explanations. And as we saw, factors that are thought to operate primarily implicitly, like non-epistemic reasons for persisting, are unlikely to come up in open-ended responses. So in experiment 2, we had a basically replication of the first experiment, but instead of having open-ended responses, we had closed-ended analogs. So we didn't have that opinion explanation part at the very end. Instead, we had 11 closed-ended items with 1 through 7 Likert scales attached to them. So an example of an epistemic item might be people who disagree with me about whether GMOs are safe for human consumption are not as good as I am at evaluating this issue. This is obviously an epistemic reason for persisting in one's view. Okay, so when you look at these 11 items and you do a factor analysis to see which cluster together, you find pretty straightforwardly that the items that we intended to correspond to, for instance, the epistemic factor, indeed cluster together. We found the same thing for the meta-epistemic, non-epistemic, and ignorance factors as well. When we look at the data, we also see some other important findings. One is that the epistemic factor, once again, is explaining more of the variation in the data than the other kinds of explanations. We also replicated domain differences from experiment 1 using factor scores, finding, for instance, that epistemic explanations were much more likely to be generated, or, in this case, items corresponding to epistemic explanations much more likely to be rated higher for scientific controversies. Okay, so a quick summary. We found that people persist in their beliefs in the presence of widespread disagreement. We found that 4 distinct paths can lead to persistence, and that people use different paths to persistence when it comes to different kinds of controversies. So one very straightforward implication of this work is that we need to develop targeted path-specific interventions to address persistence in views, and if there are multiple paths being taken to persistence, we need to address all of them. Following up from this first point, we can sort of try to resolve the puzzle that we started with. Why was it the case that when it came to the dress, people were much more likely to say, I don't know, after being exposed to large-scale disagreement? Well, obviously, none of these factors are really things that you can appeal to in the case of the dress. You don't have ignorance because I asked you to reflect on it. You don't have the epistemic because color perception is not really the sort of evidential, difficult computation. You don't have meta-epistemic explanations available to you because color perception is thought to be relatively objective, at least by lay people. And you don't have any non-epistemic reasons to think that I might judge you, for instance, if you change your view. When it comes to fossil fuels, on the other hand, some paths may not be available, but you do often have epistemic and non-epistemic reasons for persisting in your views. Perhaps if you change your mind about climate change, you would be ostracized by your own communities or by the scientific community right here. Perhaps you have epistemic reasons for thinking that people that disagree with you when it comes to climate change may not have access to the right kinds of evidence. That might be a reasonable position to hold for this audience. But that brings us to present and future directions with this work. First, we're trying to figure out which algorithms normatively people should and descriptively people do rely on when making inferences about large-scale disagreement. This is work that's being done in conjunction with Tom Griffiths. We're collecting more empirical evidence, where we just collected some causal evidence that people in fact use these paths to persisting in their views. We're collaborating with Elaine Kaman on whether we can sort of explain individual differences in mind changing using the questions that fall out from this framework. And I'm extremely open to collaborations and discussions, so please feel free to reach out if any of this sparked an idea in you. With that, I would like to thank you for listening, thank Tanya Lombroso for her wonderful mentorship and ideas, and I will take questions. I love the sort of dramatic walk up there, you know, it's pretty far away.
So what you've told us doesn't look very promising for changing opinions in positive directions, given people are resistant. But we've seen some examples, like what kinds of marriage are allowed and so on, where society has changed. So how would you conjoin your results here with the few cases where society, or many cases where society has managed to produce significant changes in views that seem at odds with the results you're telling us?
I love that question. I also love the dramatic walk away. So the question being, how do we explain organic cases of massive view change if persistence seems so likely? Sort of theoretically, what I would want to appeal to is I would have to say something with these factors, right, must have changed such that that enabled view change on that issue. Perhaps there used to be meta-epistemic reasons for persisting in views when it came to something, but the status of that changed. For instance, let's think of an example here. You might have thought that the question of whether the Earth is in the center of the universe is fundamentally unknowable when astronomy didn't exist. So you may have had a really solid meta-epistemic reason for persisting in your view when it came to that question. But when technology advanced and we in fact started being able to gather observations and data, maybe now you don't have that meta-epistemic reason to persist in your views. Maybe you now have epistemic reasons to change your views. So with time, if sufficient amount of these factors change, view change is possible, at least according to the theory, and perhaps we can get leverage on this question by historical analysis. Another dramatic walk up. I love it.
So you hinted at some causal evidence at the end. Are you
Yeah.
comfortable just telling us a bit about that? That sounded really exciting.
Yes, very comfortable. Basically, we utilized a game show setup where we told people that they had some prior view going into an issue. We then gave them evidence, sort of large-scale evidence of how a group of people thought about the same issue. And we manipulated the meta-epistemic and epistemic factors. So to manipulate the epistemic factor, we manipulated whether the large-scale evidence came from a group of kids, so that gives you epistemic reasons to persist, a group of peers, so that's sort of ambivalent, and a group of experts, so that blocks your epistemic path to persisting in your views. For the meta-epistemic, we manipulated whether the issue was scored to be unknowable or fundamentally subjective or knowable, so there was a separate slider for that. So of course, if it was scored to be unknowable, you would also have a meta-epistemic reason to persist in your views. And we found that both of these manipulations have an effect on mind changing such that when your epistemic explanation is blocked, so you're receiving information from experts, and your meta-epistemic explanation is blocked so that it's a knowable issue, you update much, much more than you do when these paths are just allowed to be the way they normally are. Okay. Any online questions? Do we have a
No, we
technical?
don't have online questions.
We do have a technical chair, it sounds like.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we don't have online questions.
Great. Okay. Then we can move on with the next speaker.